Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of The Root of It. Today, I have a really special guest, Gordon Denny, who's joined on as a ZeaKal board advisor. Gordon, great having you with us today.
Thank you. Great being here.
So, Gordon, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a second, but I think the story of how we got connected was really interesting. It feels like something out of maybe The Empire Strikes Back, where I was crawling through the wasteland of trying to set up this new type ag system that we've been talking a lot about. And I remember I was speaking with an animal nutritionist, and this was about the fourth or fifth meeting I had, where everyone was saying to me, the most challenging part about getting the industry to change, about getting the industry to adopt value over volume, better nutrition, sustainability, everything that we've been talking about for the past few roots of it, they said, is the processor. They said, unless you can get a processor that's willing to take on a different bean, process it, preserve that identity, and communicate those values throughout the entire chain and sharing that value, this model will never work. And it felt like that was going to be a barrier, a red flag. I felt like I was building a pier, not a bridge. And I remember around that time, one nutritionist said to me, they said, there's one former processor that you need to talk to. He is might be the only honest, transparent, and direct processor that you'll meet and get the real story. So I went to the mountain, I climbed the mountain to meet the sage, and
Uh,
after that, the rest is history, and you were able to come on board. And for today's session, we've titled it Back to a Value Focused Future. So the audience needs to get out their DeLoreans and take a look at what we can do to make soy quality better. Before we start, maybe Gordon, just give the audience a quick intro of your background and kind of your history in the space.
sure. Been in the soybean business for about 42 years. It's about the only thing I've done since I left the service and out of college. And I'm a little bit unique in that I've got two major areas of soybeans that I've been directly involved with. One is the commodity trading side of the business, and the other is the soybean processing side. I was a plant manager and then the director of procurement for Bunge. And so anyway, it gives me a unique perspective. I am very direct, honest. I'm sure I'll alienate somebody or say something off cue today, but it's just the way I am. And when you're a processor, commodity trader, and a former Marine Corps infantry officer, there's not much gray area. Being very direct, being very succinct, and that's the way I was raised. That's the only thing I know. So I probably should apologize in advance for saying something that will alienate someone today. So anyway, I apologize for that.
Well, perfect, Gordon. That's a rare combination. We appreciate honesty more than anything on this show. So, maybe for the audience, to start off with, give them a perspective of soybeans, because when we think of soybeans, we think of tofu, maybe edamame, but in fact, for food products, it's actually a very limited part of how soy is being used because we have hundreds of millions of acres across the world. Kind of just maybe to level set, can you give a brief introduction to the soy industry and how the soy products are being consumed?
Sure. Soybeans are traditionally the second largest row crop in acres in the United States, and that will vary typically between 80 and 90 million acres, with only corn usually exceeding the amount of acres planted in the United States on an annual basis. So it is the major feed crop for poultry, swine. It is included in every ration that I know of, certainly for broilers, layers, turkeys, pork, and it is the highest quality and essential digestible amino acids of any crop of any feed ingredient in the world. So, secondly, it's a unique product in that it has two major components. It has the high protein soybean meal, and it also has the very high quality, healthy, essential oils, the fat in a soybean. So that goes into primarily food ingredients in the past, oils for fryers, for restaurants, into every day, everyone listening to this consumes soybean oil in some form or fashion. Its ingredients and everything from mayonnaise to donuts to you name it, it contains soybean oil. It is the most prevalent and available and least used to be the most expensive oil in the United States. And even now we're transitioning soybean oil into green renewable biodiesel in a big way because of mandates from certain states, California in particular, whereby burning fossil fuels is being diminished, and by either mandates and or subsidies, green renewable soybean oil is the energy source of choice, and it looks like it will be in the future. So the demand for soybeans for protein and oil makes it a very unique crop, a very valuable. Matter of fact, it is an essential crop to feed the world in a healthy, safe, sustainable, and cost-effective fashion.
Wonderful. So Gordon, as I kind of alluded to during the introduction, the processors seem to control a major part of the supply chain, and they kind of dictate, the products that come out of it for the end users. You had mentioned all the different livestock companies, the nutritionists that buy the soy for animal feed, and also the oil side. So the processors are gatekeepers. Can you tell the audience a little bit, in your decades as a processor and a trader, what was your job, and what drove you during those years?
If we just use round numbers, we'll say there are about 4 billion bushels of soybeans grown in the U.S. on an annual basis. It's a little bit more than that here lately, and about half of those soybeans are processed domestically here in the United States to provide soybean meal for the poultry and swine primarily, although some does go into dairy and beef. And then some other goes into the oil, obviously, and goes into food and now energy. So processors are the first step in that transition from a raw soybean into soybean meal and soybean oil. Worldwide, and again, about half of our meal or half of our soybeans are exported around the world. China being our number one customer, about 60 to 65% of the exportable soybeans end up going to China. So somewhere in the world, about 97, 98% of the soybeans grown in the United States are sold and processed by a soybean processor. So these are solvent process plants. That industry has been around for probably 70, 75, maybe 80 years. And it's a very efficient, very safe, very sustainable method of extracting soybean oil and leaving this high protein soybean meal. So that processor is the most important first step in creating this additional value. And there can be anywhere from 80 cents a bushel additional value up to $3 additional value that a processor contributes to the value of that soybeans. So anyway, they are essential. If I had to boil it down and say, well, we only really have two customers in the soybean industry. One are the processors, and because they, again, 98% of the beans grown in the United States, either through export or domestically, get processed by a processor. And then number two, the animal nutritionists that formulate, feed, and look at the essential digestible amino acid profile of the soybean meal and include that. In a typical broiler, it might be 20, might be as high as 27 or 28% of a broiler ration is soybean meal. So it is the primary, most important source of protein for animals fed in the United States.
And Gordon, I think the importance of soy and how it's used can't be underestimated. And you use the word value a lot in that summary. But again, the way that we met, I felt like there was a lot of anger from the customers around soybeans, because that's really how we were introduced under is, when we talked about value, a lot of the nutritionists that we spoke to were moving away from soybeans. They kept, telling us that, yeah, 10 years ago, this would have been great, but we've stopped or we've reduced soy significantly in our rations because quality has been dropping. And they blame the processors. They say that the processors, they're making, worse and worse quality meal every year. We keep changing our formulations. Our costs are going up to get the same productivity out of the animals we feed. We have to buy more products at higher prices, and they're less efficient. And so that's where a lot of that anger came in, and a lot of that, what I'll call distrust of the industry. And again, it kind of added to our understanding of this fragmentation in the supply chain. Gordon, I'm gonna give you a chance to redeem the processor. As a former processor, I'm gonna give you a chance to redeem them. Can you
Yeah.
explain why this has existed? What is driving this, decrease in quality? And as a processor, are they contributing to it consciously or unconsciously? And do they want to change?
Kind of an evolution in a commodity. And again, I've got a processor perspective. I wear a processor hat. I retired from Bunge about 12 years ago. And by the way, since then, I've primarily been consulting for the United Soybean Board and the United States Soybean Export Council and other industry processors and seed tech companies and SPACs and some folks like that that are interested in the industry and investing in even petroleum oil companies who want to get into the soybean processing because of the oil value. And when I started in the industry right out of the Marine Corps in 1980, a bushel of soybeans was heavier. It had more protein. The value of soybeans in 1980 per bushel, and when I say value, I'm talking the extractable value for a nutritionist or a processor was greater than today. I would like to go back to the future in terms of the soybean quality. It was heavier in test weight, and we could actually make 48 to 48 and a half, sometimes 49% protein soybean meal. Today, the guarantees are 46.5% protein. We have a disconnected soybean value chain. And by that, I mean every link is functioning logically within its own entity. But where it links up with the other entity, they oftentimes view that entity as a competitor or someone they have to compete against for either price or market share. So what that has done is it has encouraged the creation of soybeans based on field yield and not processing yield. The processors have kind of accepted that because they kind of had to.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we're seeing soybeans come in at much lower protein, the industry standards for that level of protein have dropped. Oil yields have been fairly steady, but again, the breeders have increased additional non-energy components of carbohydrates. Raffinose and stachyose have gone up because that's an easy way to get field yield. But it also diminishes the amount of available protein, crude protein, and the corresponding essential digestible amino acids. So bottom line, the processors are acting very logically within their sphere. They are processing soybeans in a very efficient, very cost-effective manner with high volumes. And the processor have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the domestic industry so that they have great demand. So the U.S. processors are committed, focused, dedicated. They want to feed the world in a sustainable, safe, nutritious, cost-effective fashion, and they put their money where their mouth is. It's not primarily their fault, and it's not really the seed technology companies that are producing lower quality seed, and it's certainly not the farmers who are growing what the incentives are telling them. We're going to pay you on a per bushel basis, almost regardless of the protein and oil content. So we need to move the U.S. soybean industry to a higher quality soybean, higher value soybean, and yet not inhibit field yields so that the farmer, the processor, the exporter, and the nutritionist all get what they want. And that's a more nutrient dense, more physically dense raw material so that we can feed animals better and more efficiently, so that we can, even the equipment in a plant, the truck, everything about it, if we become more nutrient dense, our sustainability index goes up, the values go up, the profit margins go up.
So Gordon, if the processors, if you will, are, as you said, logical agents in the supply chain, it's neither malicious nor greedy, and we should not be painting them as such. If the end users are demanding it, then why is that not translating into a behavior change? So where are these links or breakages in the links occurring? Because, what I'm hearing isn't that oh yeah, what we want, lower value and we'll pay less for. It's come to a point where, I think people will like to pay more for a better quality product, but they're not getting it. So even though that there's demand for it, it seems like no one's building it for what the consumer, in this case, the livestock producers, people looking for nutrient density. It seems like though there's this demand, no one is actually building it. Why is that?
Little bit of a race to the bottom, death by a million pinpricks kind of a thing that just gradually, slowly happens over time, where the quality of, and if you saw a graph of the soybean protein in the United States over the past 30 years, it's a precipitous decline, and it is predictable it's going to continue. However, and again, through my consulting, and I've seen most of the major seed tech companies in the United States, most of the nutritionists are very interested in higher quality and higher value. But if a processor today says, okay, if I hit my minimum standards, and this will alienate a few folks, my goal as a soybean processing plant manager was to make the lowest quality meal at the lowest cost right before I hit a claims level. What that means is if I guaranteed 47.0 protein on outbound, I could ship as low as 46.5% protein and not have to refund any money as a claim to that buyer. So I would leave more hulls. I wouldn't dry it down as much as I could to hit those minimum trade standards. And every year, not every year, but every few years, what I've seen is the industry will lower their protein guarantees simply because the quality of the beans does not allow that processor to make the high quality meal that they would like to make. They want to make better quality meal, but two things have to happen. One, they have to have the seed come in. Secondly, they need to have a buyer willing to pay them to make better meal. So that gap, that communication issue, that disconnected soybean value chain between the processor and the nutritionist, they almost never talk. Our two most valuable customers seldom are in the same room together. I don't recall really ever having them in the same room together. There's usually buyers and or brokers that make purchases based on how many rail cars this week on what railroad do you need at what feed mill. So logistics is a big dictator of who buys from where, when, and at what price. But many, many nutritionists are now beginning to realize if I improve my communication, if I'm willing to pay a little bit more, I can get better quality soybean meal from a processor. There isn't a plant in the United States today that I couldn't go in to make higher quality soybean meal.
Mm-hmm.
But then somebody has to pay me for it because I'm either using more energy or I'm sacrificing a profit opportunity by overdrawing it, by over dehulling it, by doing things to that meal I don't have to do unless I'm rewarded to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, Gordon, if you were to say that the industry might be at a turning point,
Mm-hmm.
that for the first time, we're now having these types of conversations, these communications. Do you think that the quality has just gotten to a point now where, as you said, race to the bottom, but we're kind of past that point of no return, where if we don't do something with soybeans, we're going to lose one of our most valuable protein crops? And if so, what are the drivers now? Like, what is it about right now in the landscape where if you were to step back into a plant and you were to operate it, what is different now that will allow you to go in and say, we now have the right incentives, the right technology, the right customer engagement? What is changing that gives you hope that this trend will not continue but be reversed?
Well, first, I don't think we're going to lose soybeans as a crop. It's too big, it's too major. The infrastructure, the farmer, the crop rotations that enhances the soil. So I think it's going to be around, but I think the value and therefore the margins that the farmer and the processor sees will suffer. They have suffered. And so getting that farmer incentivized to ask for better quality soybeans and getting the seed tech companies to buy that. I've worked with major seed tech companies in the last couple of years with projects where they're looking at higher quality, higher crude protein because they see this as a problem. Formulators, nutritionists can work around soybean meal and diminish the inclusion rates by using DDGs, distillers dried grains from the ethanol process. They can use synthetic amino acids. They can use canola meal. So there's lots of substitutes. Excuse me. And as people see these other competing proteins enter in, that, excuse me, I think it will hurt the U.S. soybean process, and it has. Excuse me.
And, and look, actually, Gordon, I think that was one of the major drivers for our conversation at that time. Was you mentioned corn DDGS, which is really interesting. The particular nutritionist that we were speaking to was saying how he had almost halved soybeans as an inclusion in his rations because of that combination of synthetic amino acids and corn DDGS. But this brings up the issue of resiliency. We saw corn DDGS basically disappear during the pandemic because people weren't driving, ethanol went away, and DDGS was that byproduct, and they had to go back, to soy. And I think that was one of the key things also, is not just about the alternatives to soy, but how do we make every single crop more resilient, more sustainable? And so with this trend right now where consumers are demanding sustainability, we want our food to be more sustainable, not just in terms of, the environmental impact, but sustainable in terms of having, assurance of quality, assurance of production, reliability of delivery. How do you think value and, increasing the value of the crop could impact sustainability metrics as now a major driver for the adoption?
Huge way. And every day I get up early and I read articles on the internet about corporate sustainability drives, slapping a label on a product that a consumer demands or they won't buy it, EU regulations, US regulations. So I think there's three major things that are changing right now in the marketplace. Number one is the demand for carbon capture and sustainability. Totally agree with that. The greenhouse gases, the effects on the environment that in some cases feel almost irreversible, but I think soybeans are a key crop in carbon sequestration, and we will have the highest sustainability index from our crop as opposed to other crops. I firmly believe that. So anyway, sustainability. Secondly, is this high demand for oil is going to transition the marketplace. Historically, soybean meal accounted for 2/3 at least, sometimes 3/4 of the value of soybean. The dry matter, the protein, is what the market wanted. The other 1/4 to 1/3 was for the oil component. Right now, it feels like we're moving to parity, meaning about 50% of the value of a bean is in the oil and about 50% is in the protein. And that's driven, and we just set a record all-time high forever on the price of soybean oil this week on the CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So the demand for renewable green biodiesel has driven the price of soybean oil up 100% over the past year. So therefore, other competing oils, they are reaping the benefit of the demand for soybean oil to burn in a diesel truck. And it feels like diesel trucks are going to be around quite a while, just simply because the push toward electrics won't allow that to transition long haul highway transportation. But again, sustainability, higher oil. And then thirdly, the main thing I wanted to mention is that high prices that we're experiencing now are simply not sustainable. And for multiple reasons. One, it helps South America out more than it helps the United States. They can play the exchange rate game. They can play the strike and politics game. They can bring land into production much cheaper than we can in the United States. Not all that's good land to bring into production. If you're looking from a sustainability, carbon capture, deforestation perspective. So anyway, South America is helped out by high prices more than the US farmer. Number two, it helps other competing proteins, as I mentioned, DDGs, canola meal, synthetic amino acids out as much or more than soybean meal with high prices. They raise their margins as well. Thirdly, and this is one thing I hate as a human being, it increases world food insecurity. And the UN Food Index has had 12 consecutive months of increases, meaning the cost of everything we eat on a daily basis. And one of those major components is oils and fats that we need. So the amount of increased hunger in the world because of the biodiesel trend, it has increased. So we just need to make more oil. And then lastly, input prices increase in a commodity super cycle right along with soybeans. We'll have fertilizers and chemicals and equipment and fuel all going up as well. So we need to lower the initial price of seeds. We need to keep the farmers with a good margin, but not rely just totally on high commodity prices. Again, it's not sustainable. It's not healthy for the United States or the U.S. farmer.
Yeah, Gordon, I mean, that's a quite a profound concept because, we're putting sustainability, as a top priority. And obviously this entire renewable, diesel boom that you're talking about is very much with sustainability in mind. But the other moral mission we have is affordability of nutrition. We
Mm-hmm.
can't be driving cars while people in other countries starve.
Yep.
And these are goals that are equally important, and it feels like they can be mutually exclusive, as you said, because you mentioned deforestation. I had just another conversation the other day. A young guy was telling me the story of him working for a major processor in Brazil, and he was saying that even in the 3 years he was there, he watched the border of the Amazon rainforest recede by several miles. And that was in that short of a time frame, because that's how much protein we need. I think the statistic is, China might have 100 million more pigs in the next 10 years. And that's going to eat up all the protein demand. California alone is now changing the entire oil consumption of soy in the U.S. And if this becomes a federal standard, or even if other states sign on, we don't have enough arable land to meet that demand. That's kind of what I'm hearing. So, so while right now we're making a little bit more money, where do processors see the future of this? Because I mean, it's great, as you said, this commodity super cycle, but it's really destabilizing to, food security, to, even grower incomes, because they're not necessarily making more. I just spoke with a farmer today. He told me that his fertilizer prices have, doubled. So it's not like he is going to be seeing all that margin. So what needs to change? How do we achieve what you're saying, which is to meet these dual goals of sustainability, food security, and better farmer incomes?
Processors have been doing very well for the past few years, and this year was just a tremendous year. And you can look at the stock prices of major publicly traded processors like ADM or Bunge, and you can see that they have made huge profits in soybean processing. That's good. Processors need to make money. They have huge investments, and their shareholders, employees, and their farmers around them need to have profits. So that's a great thing. They're also expanding the crush capacity significantly in the United States, with multiple new plants announced and under construction.
Mhm.
And most every plant that I know goes through a continuous debottlenecking process to increase their crush. It's a high fixed cost type of an industry. So once you've got your infrastructure, the more bushels you put through there, the lower your fixed costs and the more your profits. So
Mhm.
processors have been making good money. I don't see them needing or thinking in their own minds that we need to change a lot, except for two things. When protein is low, sometimes you have to slow your plant down. Sometimes you have to do some uneconomic things to hit your minimum protein guarantees. And sometimes you pay a lot of money out in claims. And that doesn't, I'm talking millions of dollars that you pay back to the customer because you didn't hit your protein guarantee. So higher quality, higher protein. If the photo seed can take us to a 50% protein kind of a level
Mhm.
versus today's guarantee of 46.5, in a cash crush margin calculation that I've done, there's 80 cents a bushel additional value in the protein component alone.
Mhm.
And that's just because the inclusion rates in both poultry feed, for example, they can be reduced and yet the bird will still grow as well or even better. Secondly, higher oil content of that soybean. Right now, again, with the price of oil, soybean oil doubling in a year, if we can get a soybean with higher oil content, and I did a calculation using photo seed at 14%, which is probably on the low side, that is an additional $1 per bushel value in that product. So $1.80 between combined protein and oil to crush a bushel of soybeans puts a lot of margin back into their typical 80 cents to maybe $2.50 or $3 a bushel that a processor can make. So it helps the entire industry. They can pay more for soybeans. They can afford to run harder. They can send out better quality, higher nutrient density, more oil. So improving the inputs, improving the soybean seed is the number one most beneficial, most cost productive, most profitable way for the entire industry to improve its value.
Well, Gordon, obviously we're very, very excited about, the applications of photo seed to change the industry by, as you said, densifying the oil and the protein. And I think that's the journey that we're on right now, with you. Where does it have to come from? Because everyone is in violent agreement. You mentioned earlier, seed companies, not just us, but seed companies across the industry say value is important, sustainability is important. Farmers want something that's different than just a commodity product. We talked a lot about that during our last root of it with Jim. Um, Nutritionists, the end users, customers, consumers, and customers both want something that's more sustainable, more dense, more value. And you just said that the processors want it as well, that this actually, even without needing the rest of the industry to change, this benefits their operations, that logic silo that they're in by themselves. Who has to make the first move on this, Gordon? Where is the easiest change going to come from to drive this? Because how can we all be in violent agreement and yet nothing changes?
I'm an unabashed capitalist. And I think when you invest in an industry and you make it profitable and you incentivize people to work hard and do the right thing, that just feels right. So, and there's two emotions that every capitalist, including myself, that are dear to us: fear and greed. So we have to be afraid of losing a customer or a market share or a product. And then we have to be a little bit greedy, thinking, well, I want to make more money. I want to do right for my shareholders and my employees and my local farmers. So if we look at fear and greed as an incentive, which again, I firmly believe that, and that's when trade takes place. When fear and greed come together, that's when people trade a commodity or make a purchase or a sale. The processors have to be willing to pay more to incentivize a farmer to grow a better quality seed. And then the end users have to be willing to pay. So that's the dilemma that I think by forming a partnership, the existing relationships, this disconnected soybean value chain is a huge opportunity. Somehow getting them to communicate better, to understand clear economics. Here's what we can provide. Here's the cost of providing that. Here's the benefits of that. There's money left on the table. So splitting up that pot of money to the farmer, to the processor, to the traders, to the nutritionists, and to make a healthier, the improved feed conversion ratios for broilers and eggs and turkeys and pigs, to do all that and then yet fuel the diesel trucks in California or Oregon or Washington or wherever. That's where we're headed. I just think it takes a little bit of patience because this is a giant economic agricultural ship. So it takes a while to get this turned in the right direction. But I feel I'm optimistic that it has. There's been too much discussion from the seed companies and processors that I just feel like we're right on the cusp. And I think more and more nutritionists realize I can afford to pay for higher value. And the feed trials that we have run will prove the efficacy, the economic viability, and the demand for higher essential digestible amino acids, crude protein, and energy.
The concept that we're talking about today in 2021 is not necessarily new, right? Because
No.
I remember when I started in the industry back in 2005, my mentor at that time, Jerry Calder, Jerry said to me, he goes, "Look, there was two schools of thoughts: input traits and output traits." And he was talking about biology at that time. And
Mhm.
so-called input traits are ones that help agronomically, and so-called output traits are ones that change value, sustainability, composition. And he said, input traits won, output traits completely failed. And that stuck with me over all my years. In fact, it was something that I kind of took to heart, saying that we'll never be able to commercialize an output trait. And that was one of the biggest mental shifts that I had to do to believe in it, in terms of this industry going this direction. Gordon, sitting from the processing side, not necessarily like where I was sitting from the genetic side, why did things fail in the past? Because I don't think that this willingness is necessarily new. I think it's different this time. But I feel like the cycle has happened before. But what failed about those previous cycles?
I think what failed in the past was a cohesive way to get people to communicate effectively. There was no discussion of the economics. It was just, hey, we want better quality meal. Well, are you willing to pay for it? I'll just take what I get. That's kind of the rhetoric of the past 25 or 30 years.
Mhm.
So until somebody's ready to pay for higher protein, it was hard to capture that. The oil value was a little different.
Mhm.
So if a soybean comes in and it's 11 pounds of oil in a bushel, another one comes in, it's 11.8 pounds per bushel. A processor can capture that value. So that's a real tangible weight of that soybean oil coming out of that bushel of soybeans. But the protein was always this kind of soft, fuzzy, esoteric, non-tangible thing that you had to get somebody to pay for. So now I think if we can get higher oil, that may be the incentive to get people to talk about, hey, let's become more efficient. I also think the industry has done just a terrible job in touting the benefits of genetic modification. And it should be
Mhm.
called scientifically enhanced rather than
Like that.
GMO.
Yeah.
So the benefits in feeding the world safer, less 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 money, more the yields are much better. The crop inputs in terms of herbicides, insecticides, water, the trips across the field, there have literally been hundreds of billions of dollars in savings, and we have fed the world in a cheaper, safer, more sustainable and healthy fashion because of that. We all got the COVID shot. GMO type modifications. So, I mean, if we
Yep.
look at the other things where GMO has been accepted and utilized to make our lives better. So whether it's an NGO, whether it's I don't know, some group that thinks that GMO is bad, they're wrong.
Mhm.
Just plain simply wrong.
So, no, Gordon, you mentioned a lot of trends here. So, consumer acceptance is obviously really important in food and agriculture, that we want to continue to educate the consumer. And I often use this, saying that we have to win not only their minds, but their hearts as well, that this is truly something that aligns with their values. And I do think that so-called next gen technologies that can work on sustainability, can work on affordable access to nutrition, that these have a much more tangible consumer story than, say, first generation traits, which were mostly agronomic benefits that the consumer didn't see or could understand as well. You had mentioned that structurally things had changed with these commodity markets, where now the processor has an incentive to want something that's more nutrient dense, where maybe the spillover benefit is we do get better, co-products, higher protein, as a result of oil being a bigger component. So that could drive change at each silo, and in turn get them to work together. Do you see anything technologically that is now enabling this model to come together? Because you mentioned earlier on that processors, they're getting bigger and bigger, right? They want to
Mhm.
run harder and harder. And while that's great in terms of driving down the cost of production, it also means that that ship that you mentioned, using that analogy, is going to get harder and harder to turn if it's going, that
Yep.
fast. So what do you see technology wise that's going to offer us scale yet nimbleness. Like if you were operating a plant again today, what are the things, the toys or the tool sets that you didn't have, a few years ago that would allow you to say, you know what, I can be as efficient, but I can also be nimble in terms of creating multiple product streams based on different segments, based on consumer preference. Because one of the most important things I think is also that ag, despite being efficient, needs to be more reactive to changing trends in the world, consumer preferences all across the board. Do you see things now that will make your life a lot easier?
A couple of things come to mind. Number one, over the past few years, we have learned how, as a processor, to do IP runs, identity preserved campaigns, for example, whether it was low linolenic, whether it was non GMO, whether it's high oleic. We've learned that, okay, there's a demand with a premium for these commodities that aren't in a big volume amount. So the processors primarily learned how to run their plants. They're all set up to just run and go with basic bulk commodity commingled soybeans to make soybean meal and soybean oil as a generic product. So these specialty products have taught processors how to become a little more fine tuned and do these specialty runs. Number one. Number two, NIR technology, near infrared reflectance, that can analyze inbound soybeans and outbound meal. It's instant, it's accurate, it's reliable. You can tune them up over the internet. The equipment prices have come down significantly. And the plants where I worked and bought for, we would analyze the inbound soybean trucks with NIR machine to determine their protein and oil content. And that was one of my measurements as a plant manager. Protein and oil in as a bean, protein out as meal, and oil yields out. So we would even know which farms, which individual farmers, which geographic areas or states grew better quality soybeans. And we would kind of target market those areas and would pay more and be more aggressive to buy higher quality beans. Processors today, not all, but some know the quality, what they're buying and where they're buying it. And more are learning how to do that. So I think learning how to do specialty runs. Number two, the NIR technology, but the old traditional processing technology. And a new plant costs anywhere from $250 million to $350 million. Takes a couple of years to build. And that's after you have your construction and environmental permits. So it's a 3 to 4 year kind of a process to get the right plant with the right infrastructure in the right place with beans, a meal, railroads. It's a complicated equation. So they're investing a lot of money, but the actual processing technology really hasn't changed in 40, 50, 60 years. We're washing solvent over the flakes, extracting the oil and toasting it and recovering the solvent so that only in the last maybe 20 years or so did the hot dehulling process come in to get the hulls to pop without, and that was an energy saving and a little bit of an efficiency improvement. So, but the technology has not changed. IP runs, NIR technology, and also improving the communications and the economic understanding of both ends of the value chain. I think that's our road to improving the value chain and getting these links to trust, communicate, and value each other's inputs.
We went through a period of consolidation, across agriculture where, seed companies consolidated, processors consolidated. We have some very, very large players throughout the entire value chain. Do you see that as our value chain becomes more consolidated, it can go one or two ways, right? It could just be that we end up as a oligopoly where things stay the same and things are slow. Or do you think partnerships might become easier with that scale where you could get now a processor and an end user to work together because that economy of scale is there? Do you see maybe consolidation or integration occurring, between the supply chain now in a different way? Is there more receptivity to it, attunement to it, or has that just gotten even bigger where these communications or these conversations are becoming even harder?
No, I think it's going to become easier. And the reason is, and this industry consolidation, which is a normal, natural, healthy evolution of any industry, it will consolidate to an optimum level of efficiency, productivity, and economic viability. So whether it's a processor or whether it's somebody feeding chickens, the knowledge of how efficient you are based over billions of chickens, for example,
Hmm.
incrementally tiny little increases in feed conversion ratios and weight gains and inclusion rates and the cost of your inputs add up to big dollars because of the scale. So as higher protein soybeans become available, and again, we have to educate the nutritionists, they're getting there. They really do begin to understand at every level, both swine and poultry, layers, you name it, because there is an organization that agglomerates data from everyone that I know, everybody that raises a chicken or hatches an egg in the United States participates with a company called AgriStats. And they look at the efficiencies of every company compared to every other company anonymously. Nobody knows who is who, but they can compare their numbers with other numbers and say, wow, we really did good this month. Or, wow, my costs and my inclusion ratios and my feed efficiency is not very good. I got to get better. So those nutritionists, and they know the quality of soybean meal from every plant in the country.
Hmm.
They look at the rail cars coming in and they analyze them either through wet lab or an NIR based on the protein,
Hmm.
the standard deviation of protein, the moisture, the fat, the fiber, the toasting or the urease activity, and the ash content. So they'll look at all those criteria, plug that into a formula, assign a value to that rail car,
Hmm.
and then they'll go to their buyers and say, look, and right now there's about a $15 per short ton spread in quality from one soybean processing plant to another in the United States. So they'll say maximize purchases from this plant because in a feed ration, it's worth $15 a ton more than it is out of this plant.
Hmm.
Again, logistics and rail cars and railroads dictate a lot of the purchases, but for every 1% of protein that we increase soybean meal, it's worth about $8 a short ton
Hmm.
in value to somebody feeding a broiler, for example.
Hmm.
So he wants to know, and also right now, especially with the cost of oils and feed fats, that is a huge consideration. So if one processor isn't running well and has high residual soybean oil in the meal, high feed fat, that's worth a lot of money.
Hmm.
If one processor is over drying their soybean meal to increase their protein, you only have this much to work with, and
Hmm.
everything competes with everything else in a
Right.
finished product, just like a soybean.
Yep.
So if they have high fat, low moisture soybean meal, when you plug that into a formula, that's going to make that meal much more valuable.
Hmm.
You can either do that through running bad and having low quality soybeans, or you can do it through improving that value in that process with higher quality soybeans, higher protein, higher fat.
Wonderful. Well, Gordon, I think you've given us a lot to think about as we look to the future. What does that future look like to you? So maybe give the audience a sense of, you know, in your kind of ideal world where the chain is harmonized, if you had a wish list of things that you wanted to see or the way that people will behave, industry standards, how we all work together, technologies, what would that future look like, to kind of wrap this up?
First thing, number one, by far, is higher quality input products, higher quality soybeans, higher quality corn. If we can improve that nutrient and physical density, um, that is the number one thing we can do to improve the outputs
Mhm.
without increasing costs and raising the value. So, higher quality soybeans and corn. Number two, the value chain alignment and communication and shared goals.
Mhm.
Um, the processors and the nutritionists have to get in the room and understand that there's money left on the table and that we can improve overall efficiencies. And then number three, we do have some antiquated trade standards. The trade standards for soybean meal haven't really been adjusted much in decades. So it incentivizes me. As a matter of fact, as the industry has lowered the standards on protein on an annual basis, even the CME group lowered some of the delivery requirements on soybean meal and soybean. So by improving our trade standards and incentivizing a plant manager to not make the worst quality meal at the lowest cost before he gets claimed, have a premium scale, or at least raise those standards so that not having your optimum maximized quality out of a plant. So again, better soybean quality, value chain communication, and improving the quality claims process, the trade standards are three pretty viable things that I see that could help the entire, and the farmers will recoup. They will be the beneficiaries. Farmers and
Yep.
processors will benefit by this improved value chain. There'll be more demand, there'll be more margins, and we have to improve margin spread.
Mhm.
We can't just rely on high prices to help the
Mhm.
farmer.
Wonderful. Well, Gordon, thank you very much for your time today. It was a great education for those of us that may not understand exactly what this little bean does and how important it is across the world. So appreciate you sharing decades of wisdom and a look back at the past and a very hopeful future for how we can more sustainably nourish the world. Hope you guys enjoyed the session today. If you missed any of the other roots of it, they are on the ZeaKal website, and we'll hopefully see you again our next session. In the meantime, please follow us on our Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you.